Every spring, the same conversation happens at garden centers across America. A gardener walks in, looks at the display tables full of color, and reaches for the same plants they bought last year. The impatiens, the petunias, the marigolds, the plants that looked beautiful in the pictures and looked beautiful in the pot and looked beautiful for about 3 weeks in the garden before the heat arrived, or the rain arrived, or the slugs arrived, or simply time arrived, and the whole display collapsed into something that looked more like a chore than a garden. And the gardener who planted those flowers will be back next spring, do it again. Because nobody at the garden center has any financial incentive to explain that the plant being purchased is a temporary solution to a problem that has a permanent answer. That permanent answer is what this video is about. Not a list of plants to avoid without explanation, but a specific pairing. For every flower on this list that costs money every spring and produces disappointment every summer, there is a replacement that costs the same amount once, goes in the ground once, and then comes back every year looking better than the year before without being asked. Smart gardeners made this switch years ago. The ones watching this video can make it today. 9 flowers are on this list. 9 replacements are waiting. And make sure to stay until the very end, because the 9th pairing on this list involves a flower that most American gardeners have been buying every single year for decades. And the replacement that does everything it does but comes back permanently is one of the most beautiful perennials available in American horticulture. That information is coming. Do not leave before it arrives. Flower 1, annual impatiens, replace. With Astilbe, impatiens are the default shade flower of American gardening, and they earn that status for one reason. They produce reliable color in the places where most other flowers refuse to grow. In the deep shade under trees along the north side of the house, in the shadowed beds that receive almost no direct sun, impatiens bloom. They bloom cheerfully, and they bloom continuously, and they bloom in colors that make the dark corners of the garden look intentional and cared for. And then fall arrives, and the first frost takes every single one of them, and the bed that was full of color 2 weeks ago is bare soil again. The purchase that was made in May needs to be made again in May, every year, indefinitely. The replacement is Astilbe, and the comparison between what impatiens delivers and what Astilbe delivers in the same shaded location is not close. Astilbe produces feathery plumes of flower in June and July, pink, red, white, and purple, in colors that glow in shade with a luminosity that few flowers in any light condition can match. The texture of those plumes, soft and feathery and catching every shift of light in the shadowed garden, creates a visual richness that the flat, rounded blooms of impatiens never achieve. And Astilbe does not need to be purchased again. The rhizomes that spread outward from the crown each season produce new flowering crowns every year, expanding the planting and increasing the bloom density without any replanting, any division, or any additional expense. A bed that begins with 6 Astilbe plants in the first season becomes 12 in the second, becomes 20 in the third, filling the shaded space with increasing abundance, while the impatiens gardener is making their annual May trip to the garden center to start over. Smart. Gardeners know that the transition from impatiens to Astilbe requires exactly 1 season of patience. The Astilbe planted this year will bloom this summer. It will come back next summer with more flowers, and the summer after that, and the summer after that, compounding in beauty every season while asking for nothing more than consistent moisture and the shade conditions it evolved to thrive in. The shade garden that was replanted every spring becomes a shade garden that manages itself, that gets richer and more beautiful every year, while the gardener does something else with the time and money that used to go. Toward May transplants. Flower 2, annual petunias, replace with Salvia nemorosa petunias, are the flower that most Americans picture when they think of a summer container or a window box. Those tumbling, colorful, cheerfully informal blooms that fill hanging baskets and front porch planters from May through October with an enthusiasm that no other annual quite matches. And for containers and hanging baskets, Petunias are genuinely difficult to replace. But in garden beds, where petunias are planted in the ground as border flowers and then deadheaded weekly and watered daily and replaced when they stretch and flop in midsummer heat, in garden beds, the case for petunias versus the case for salvia. Nemorosa is not close. Salvia nemorosa, the ornamental sage, produces upright spikes of deep blue-violet, flower in late spring and early summer that are among the most useful colors in the garden palette. Blue is rare in the ornamental flower world, and the particular blue-violet of May-night or Caradonna salvia is a saturated, intense color that reads from a distance and makes every warm color planted near it. The oranges and yellows of summer perennials. The reds of roses look richer and more intentional by contrast. After the first bloom flush, a light cutback triggers a second wave of flowers in midsummer and often a third in early fall. 3 distinct periods of blue-violet bloom from a plant that asks for sun and reasonable drainage and nothing else. And then it comes back, without being asked, without being purchased again. The crown that spent the winter underground pushes new growth in early spring, reaches blooming size by late spring, and produces the same extraordinary blue-violet display it produced the year before, except larger, because the crown has grown through another season and has more energy to invest in flowers. The petunia bed that required weekly deadheading and biweekly watering and midsummer replacement when the plants flopped becomes a salvia border that manages itself, blooms 3 times per season, and grows more floriferous every year. From Zone 4 through Zone 8, this replacement works in every American climate where petunias are currently being planted and replanted. Flower 3, annual marigolds, replace with Coreopsis marigolds, occupy a specific and genuinely useful role in the vegetable garden. Their root chemistry suppresses certain soil-borne pests, populations and their above-ground volatiles. It deters specific flying insects from locating nearby crops. As a pest management companion plant in the vegetable bed, the case for marigolds is real and documented. But as a general ornamental border flower, planted in beds across American front yards every spring for their orange and yellow color, and then composted every fall, and replaced the following spring. As a border ornamental, marigolds have a permanent replacement that delivers the same warm color palette, the same bloom duration, the same pest deterrent volatiles, and comes back on its own every year. Coreopsis, tickseed, produces golden yellow, orange, and bicolor flowers from early summer through fall in a continuous bloom display that outlasts the marigold season and requires 0 deadheading to maintain. The flowers are lighter and more delicate in texture than marigolds, small, cheerful daisies on fine stems that create an airy, informal quality in the garden rather than the dense, formal blocks of color that marigolds produce. In the landscape, Coreopsis blooms with the effortless, naturalistic abundance of a wildflower, which is appropriate because several species are native to the American prairies and meadows. That native origin is what makes Coreopsis so indifferent to heat, drought, and poor soil. It evolved in conditions that defeat most garden annuals. The varieties available at American garden centers include Moonbeam, whose soft pale yellow is one of the most useful and most sophisticated flower colors for combining with other perennials. Zagreb, whose compact form and vivid gold make it the workhorse of the front border, and the newer Lil Bang series that extends the color range into hot pinks and bicolors while maintaining the self-sufficient, come-back-every-year performance of the species. From Zone 4 through Zone 9, Coreopsis blooms from June through October, comes back every spring, and spreads steadily to fill its allotted space, replacing the marigold's temporary color contribution with a permanent one that increases every season. Flower 4, annual snapdragons, replace with penstemon snapdragons are one of the great pleasures of the cool season garden, those tall, architectural spikes covered in the distinctive hinged blooms that children have been opening and closing for generations, appearing in spring in colors that range from pure white through every shade of pink, red, orange, and yellow. The problem with snapdragons is not their beauty. It is their biology. They are cool season annuals that perform beautifully in spring and early summer, and then collapse entirely in summer heat, leaving the bed that was spectacular in May looking exhausted and spent by July. The gardener, who wants vertical flower spikes through the summer, has to replace them with something else or leave the space empty through the hottest months. Penstemon is reliably perennial from Zone 3 through Zone 8 in most species, returning every spring with increasing vigor and producing more flower spikes on the expanded crown than the previous season. The Native American species Penstemon digitalis, Penstemon strictus, Penstemon grandiflorus are particularly well adapted to American climates, having evolved in them. The hybrid cultivars like Husker Red, with its dramatic burgundy foliage and white flower spikes, or Dark Towers, with its even deeper bronze-red leaves, add an ornamental foliage dimension that snapdragons, with their undistinguished green, never provide. The vertical element in the border that snapdragons created for 3 months is replaced by vertical flower spikes from late spring through summer and ornamental foliage through every other month of the year. Right here, at the midpoint of this list, something needs to be said directly to the gardeners who have been making the same annual purchases for years and wondering, somewhere in the back of their minds, whether there is a better way. There is. Every pairing on this list represents a one-time decision that ends a recurring expense and replaces temporary color with permanent abundance. The garden center does not benefit from this information reaching the people who shop there every May. But the gardeners watching this video do. Drop a U.S. state or hardiness zone in the comments right now, because the gardeners in the same region watching this video are making the same decisions about the same replacements, and what thrives in one Zone 6 garden almost always thrives in another. Flower 5. Annual zinnias. Replace with Echinacea zinnias are the summer annual that experienced gardeners defend most vigorously, and the defense is not wrong. They bloom in a color range: the true reds, the deep oranges, the hot pinks, the lime greens, that almost no perennial can fully replicate. They cut beautifully. They bloom continuously from the moment they are planted until frost. They attract butterflies in numbers that make the summer garden feel genuinely alive. For the cutting garden, for the container, for the gardener who wants to make their own flower arrangements from midsummer through fall, zinnias are genuinely excellent and genuinely difficult to replace entirely. But in the perennial border, where the goal is a planting that builds in beauty over time, rather than one that starts over every spring, Echinacea does what zinnias do: continuous summer bloom, vivid color, extraordinary butterfly attraction, and then comes back. The pink-purple flowers of Echinacea purpurea and the warm yellows and oranges of Echinacea paradoxa and the modern hybrid cultivars that extend the color range into red, coral, and cream provide the saturated summer color palette that zinnias deliver, from a plant that is simultaneously building the root system that will produce more flowers next year, and the year after, and the year after that. A mature Echinacea colony in full August bloom, covered in swallowtails and monarchs and fritillaries, is a display that a zinnia bed, however beautiful, simply cannot match, because zinnias end in October and Echinacea returns in June. The self-seeding behavior that makes Echinacea particularly valuable as a zinnia replacement is the quality that most gardeners who switch over find most surprising. When the seed heads are left standing through winter, a practice that also feeds goldfinches and chickadees through the cold months, the item seeds they disperse germinate the following spring and bloom the summer after, expanding the colony without any intervention. The zinnia bed that required fresh seed or transplants every May becomes an Echinacea colony that plants its own succession, fills its own gaps, and grows more abundant and more beautiful every season that the gardener leaves it alone. Flower 6. Annual Cosmos. Replace with Rudbeckia cosmos is the flower that produces the most return per effort of any summer annual. Those tall, hairy plants with their fine-textured foliage and their cheerful pink, white, and crimson flowers blooming continuously from July through October on stems that need no staking, no deadheading, and almost no watering. The case for cosmos is real, but cosmos is an annual. Every plant visible in the garden this August grew from a seed sown or a transplant purchased this spring. And next spring, it all starts over. Rudbeckia fulgida, black-eyed Susan, produces the same continuous late summer and fall bloom performance as cosmos, in golden yellows that light up the garden from July through October, from a plant that goes into the ground once and comes back every year with increasing abundance. The colony that black-eyed Susan builds, through rhizome spread and self-seeding, fills the garden with that warm golden color through the second half of the season, the weeks when most spring flowers have finished and the garden most needs something carrying it forward, without any replanting, without any additional purchase, and without the annual seed-starting effort that cosmos requires in climates where direct seeding does not reliably produce plants large enough to bloom by midsummer. The wildlife contribution of Rudbeckia, the seed, heads that feed goldfinches through winter, the late-season nectar that supports monarch butterflies on their fall migration, adds an ecological dimension to the garden that cosmos, as a Mexican native that does not support American wildlife, in the same way does not provide. The gardener who replaces a cosmos bed with Rudbeckia is not just trading one flower for another. They are trading a temporary, starting over every year display for a permanent, expanding, ecologically connected planting that grows more beautiful and more valuable to the surrounding environment every season. Flower 7. Annual lobelia replace with Veronica spicata lobelia. Hierrinus, the trailing or compact annual lobelia used as edging and in containers, produces a blue-purple color that is genuinely difficult to find in the garden plant world, and it produces it in a neat, compact form that makes it useful for defining bed edges and filling the front of borders. The problem is the same problem that all annuals share: it ends. The edging that was tidy and blue in June and July becomes straggly and sparse in August heat, and by September it is finished entirely, leaving the bed edge undefined and the front of the border with nothing to carry it through fall. Veronica spicata, Spike Speedwell, produces the same blue-purple edging color in upright spikes that bloom from late spring through summer, comes back every year, and handles the summer heat that defeats annual lobelia without visible stress. The upright flower spikes create a slightly different aesthetic than the mounding habit of annual lobelia, more architectural, more vertical. But the color contribution and the placement utility are the same. After the first bloom flush, cutting the spent spikes back to the basal foliage triggers a second wave of flowers that extends the blue-purple edging contribution into late summer. The foliage that remains through fall provides a low, tidy mound that defines the bed edge even after the flowers have finished. From Zone 3 through Zone 8, Veronica returns every spring with a crown that has grown slightly larger than the previous year, producing more flower spikes and covering more of the bed edge without any replanting. The edging that required fresh lobelia transplants every May becomes a Veronica border that maintains itself, that defines the bed edge through the entire growing season, blooms twice, and expands slowly into a more substantial edging presence with every passing year. Flower 8. Annual begonias. Replace with Heuchera wax begonias are the plant that does the most work in American shade gardening for the least visual reward. Those tidy, compact, reliably blooming plants with their waxy leaves and their small pink, red, or white flowers that fill shaded beds with color from May through October without complaining about the heat or the lack of sun. They perform. The complaint is not about the performance. The complaint is that they perform the same way every year and then stop. And the gardener who has been relying on them for color in a difficult shaded spot has to start over every spring with fresh transplants from the garden center. Heuchera, coral bells, replaces begonias in the shade garden with something that is simultaneously more visually interesting, and more permanent. The foliage of modern Euchera cultivars, in shades of burgundy, bronze, caramel, silver, and lime green that have been developed through decades of breeding, provides year-round color in the shade garden that begonias, with their unremarkable green leaves, never approach. The flower spikes that rise above the foliage in late spring add a secondary bloom contribution, and the whole plant stays through fall when the begonias are finished, through winter when the evergreen to semi-evergreen foliage of Euchera provides structure and color in the bare garden, and back in spring when the crown pushes fresh new leaves in whatever extraordinary color the variety was selected for, without anyone doing anything to make it happen. The Euchera that replaces a begonia bed provides 50 weeks per year of ornamental contribution, rather than 22. It provides foliage color that is more sophisticated, more varied, and more visually interesting than begonia foliage. It provides flower spikes, and it does all of this permanently from Zone 3 through Zone 9, without being replanted, without being replaced, and without the annual May expense that begonias represent. The shade garden that was a recurring cost becomes a permanent feature. Flower 9, the one most gardeners keep buying every year. Annual geranium. Replace with hardy geranium, cranesbill. This is the pairing that most American gardeners find most surprising, and it is saved for last because the surprise is the point. The geranium, specifically pelargonium, the tender annual sold in American garden centers as a geranium, is one of the best-selling plants in American horticulture. The round clusters of red, pink, white salmon and coral flowers that sit above the rounded, distinctively scented leaves have been filling American front porch containers and window boxes and garden beds every summer since before most of the gardeners buying them were born. They are reliable. They are familiar. They are available everywhere. And every fall they die, and every spring they are purchased again, what most American gardeners have never discovered, because the retail display tables organize plants by common name, and both plants share the name geranium, is that there is a completely different plant also, called geranium, that is perennial, cold hardy, across most of the continental United States, equally beautiful, and produces a bloom display from late spring through fall that covers as much garden calendar as the annual version. Hardy geranium, geranium species, and cultivars. The true cranesbill produces saucer-shaped flowers in clear pinks, lilacs, deep purples, and white from May through October, with a reblooming habit in the better cultivars that keeps color coming through both halves of the gardening season. The flowers are smaller and more delicate than the cluster blooms of pelargonium, but there are more of them, and they cover the plant with the kind of naturalistic, effortless-looking abundance that makes a planting look like the garden grew that way on its own. Roseanne. Moraine. The hardy geranium cultivar that has won more awards and sold more plants than any other in its category produces violet-blue flowers continuously from late spring through the first frost, sprawling gracefully over bed edges, through the legs of roses under the skirts of shrubs, covering ground with a carpet of color that requires zero deadheading, zero staking, zero supplemental watering once established, and zero purchasing after the first season. It is hardy from Zone 4 through Zone 8. It returns every spring with a crown larger than the previous year. It fills more space with more flowers every season without being asked. The front porch container that gets fresh pelargonium every May becomes a garden bed that gets Roseanne once, and then simply gets more beautiful every year while the garden center's annual pelargonium display stands unremarked and unpurchased. 9 flowers, 9 replacements, 9 one-time decisions that end a cycle of annual purchasing and replace it with a garden that builds in beauty every season without being asked to start over. The garden center will still be there in May, the perennial section, the quiet section, the one without the bright color displays, the one that looks modest in its small pots and reveals nothing of what it will become, is where the permanent garden begins. The gardeners watching this video Know something now that most of the people shopping in that garden center in May have never been told. If this video helped, hit subscribe to join this gardening community and watch the next video on screen to keep building the garden that never has to start over.